Now, the final speaker of today's commemorative seminar is Ernst Baltensperger, Professor Emeritus of Macroeconomics at the University of Bern, and one of Switzerland's most famous economists and also the most influential, probably. Before joining the University of Bern, Ernst was Professor of Economics at Ohio State University, University of Heidelberg, and University of St. Gallen. And there he met Karl Brunner as a young colleague and assistant professor, as I explained that already in my introductory remarks. And Ernst was also an economist at the Swiss National Bank for some time, and also an advisor in very important times. So similar probably to Karl Brunner in the 70s, Ernst advised the Swiss National Bank several times, also in the late 1980s when we drafted the new strategy. Ernst has also served as an editor and a member of the editorial board of several academic journals, including the Journal of Money, Credit and Banking, which was founded, we heard that several times, by Karl Brunner. And during the presentation, Ernst will focus on the impact of Karl Brunner's ideas on economic thinking in Europe and particularly in Switzerland. Thank you very much, Ernst. The floor is yours.
Okay, it's a great pleasure being here on this occasion, and I'm grateful to the SNB for making this, or having made this commemorative event for Karl Brunner possible. I want to concentrate in my talk first on a few personal notes, and then afterwards I want to ask, what have you learned from Karl and from the monetarists in general? What have you learned from them which is still relevant for us today? And my answer will be much more than many people today think. Karl Brunner, as everyone attending this conference knows, of course, was one of the leading and best-known economists of his time, together with Alan Meltzer, Milton Friedman, and a number of others. He was one of the founding fathers of monetarism, a term he coined himself. It has been mentioned before today. He was the initiator of prestigious academic journals and conference series, the JMCB, the JME, the Shadow Open Market Committee, the Carnegie Rochester Conference, among others. And through all these endeavors, he also became one of the most influential economists of his time. I had the great privilege of having been closely associated with Karl in different stages of my life, and I will always be grateful for that. I first met Karl Brunner as a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University when he came there to present a seminar in the department workshop. And as a student of monetary economics, writing a dissertation in the field, and being a fellow Swiss, I had frequently heard of him, not least through Jörg Niehans, my main teacher and mentor at Johns Hopkins and formerly at Zurich here. Karl and Jörg Niehans had been student friends at the University of Zurich before and during World War II. After completing my dissertation in the autumn of 1968, I became a colleague of Karl as a young assistant professor at Ohio State University, where Karl at the time was the leading figure in the economics department. Karl left Ohio State for the University of Rochester 3 years later in 1971, but he kept close contact with the Ohio State Economics Department, and he continued to edit the JMCB for a number of years, even afterwards, and I have known him ever since. As it turned out, in a later phase of both of our lives, Karl's and mine, we became colleagues again when I joined the economics department at the University of Bern, where Karl also served as a professor and regularly was present during the summer semester from 1974 to 1986. I have very fond memories of my times with Karl, both at Ohio State and at Bern. And the uncounted contacts in between, not least those involving our common ties to the Swiss National Bank, which is organizing this commemorative event. Karl has become, together with Jörg Niehans, one of the two individuals who have influenced me most in my professional formation, and I'm extremely grateful for all he gave to me and to many others also, of course. Karl had left his native Switzerland for the USA in the late 1940s, out of dissatisfaction with the situation at Swiss universities, which at that time was quite representative of continental European universities in general. Having spent a year at the London School of Economics in 1937 and 38, Karl was acutely aware of the deficiencies of the education he received by his professors at Zurich. This is a view shared by Jörg Niehans, who once described their teachers at the University of Zurich as respectable individuals full of integrity, but, as he wrote in 1988, lagging behind the times by about half a century. Both Karl and Jörg liked telling how, together with one or two fellow students, one of them was Hermann Bieri, later a professor of economics at the University of Bern, and he happened to be my predecessor there, how they had formed a little club. It has been mentioned by Thomas Jordan today in his introduction already, a little club where they resorted to, as Niehans later expressed it once, where they resorted to, well, to self-education, to becoming autodidacts within the university, as Niehans expressed it. They were the modern economic theory of the time, Keynes, Hicks, Joan Robinson, Weiner, Wicksell, among others. Authors they were not confronted with in their formal university education, and they often spent their time in a Zurich coffee house named the Grüne Heinrich. This is what Thomas Jordan has already mentioned today before, the Green Henry, to discuss what they had read. The doctoral dissertation which Karl completed in Zurich in 1943, it was entitled Studies in the Theory of International Trade. This dissertation was apparently held in less esteem by himself than by others, than by his teachers at Zurich at the time. It did not meet the standards he had set for himself later on, he said. A little anecdote on this. Karl asked me to serve as the book review editor of the JMCB after he had founded it in 1969 at Ohio State. And in this capacity, I regularly looked at the new publications coming on the market. I remember that one day I looked at, I had a book on my desk, a new book, something on international trade. And I noted that the author, somewhere in his text, made a reference to Karl's dissertation. I mentioned this to Karl, I showed him the book, and his immediate reaction was, well, if he quotes literature like that, the book can't be worth much, throw it out. After receiving his doctorate, Karl briefly held positions in the economics department at the Swiss National Bank. This has also been mentioned before, for about 1 year, I believe, and then at the University of St. Gallen. These pictures are for that time. This one is interesting, I think. The man on the left here, the older man, this is Ernst Weber. He was the SNB president at the time. And then, of course, you see Karl Brunner over here. And this is Ernst Weber, the SNB president. This is Karl. Very serious in coat and tie. This is on an SNB excursion into the mountains, apparently, to the Rigi Mountains. And the man over here, this is H. Ernst Weber. He's the son of the SNB president. I can show you these pictures courtesy of Jörg Ernst Weber, who is with us here today. here. He is an economist himself, of course. He was a doctoral student of Karl at Rochester in the late 70s, I believe. And see, he has sent me these pictures, and I'm happy to show them to you. There are, I mean, Karl, I must say, Karl and H. Ernst Weber, the son of the president, apparently were friends from military service. This was during the war in 1943, I believe. There are a few more pictures like that. This one I like. I'll get back to it afterwards. This, again, is one which shows the SNB president here and Karl over here. Karl often complained, of course, afterwards that he had not been happy at the SNB. He has not been happy professionally, but at least here he seems to be fairly well integrated. There are a few more of these pictures from private excursions Karl took together with H. Ernst Weber, the son of the president, the father of Jörg Weber, who is with us today. This is with Rosemary, excuse me, here, with here Karl and here Rosemary. This is H. Ernst Weber and another friend, apparently. There are some more like this here. Karl again, Rosemary here. And here, Karl on top of a mountain, well, almost on top of a mountain. But I must say, I especially like this picture here, Karl and Rosemary, at an age where none of us knew them, except for, well, Alan Meltzer, if you add a few years. But I think all of the rest of us who are in here didn't know Karl at that time, so I find that very moving. This is in 1943, before he came to the US, yes. That's why I said if you add a few years, then you get to your time, but none of us knew him at that time. Yeah. Well, Karl, as I said before, and as it has been mentioned by others today before, was not particularly happy at the SNB at that time. He wasn't happy at St. Gallen either. He mentioned many times later on that at St. Gallen there had been nothing but disagreement, and St. Gallen tried to make up a little bit for that much later in the 1980s. When I was a faculty member there, we gave him an honorary degree, an honorary doctorate. Karl was at first a bit surprised. He said, well, when I was there in the 1940s, they didn't like me. There was nothing but fuss and disagreement, and now they honor me. But he did realize, of course, that it was not the same people anymore. In the end, he told me, I remember he told me, well, Ernst, if somebody tries to honor you, just accept. Don't ask why, just accept. And I think that was a very reasonable position, of course. But as I said, Karl found academic and scholarly life at these Swiss institutions in continental Europe in general at the time unsatisfactory, uninspiring, and intellectually unsatisfactory. He often commented on this in later years. And so when he was offered the opportunity to go to the USA, he applied for and received a 2-year Rockefeller Foundation fellowship. He quickly accepted it, and he moved to the New World together with Rosemary. There was a brief stay at Harvard and then a stay at Chicago, which I think was quite important for his formation. And then, of course, in 1951, he joined the faculty at UCLA, where his association with Alan Meltzer began. He later came to Ohio State, where I knew him, and finally moved to Rochester. And his academic life now was firmly anchored in the USA to the end. But nevertheless, as time went on, he started to develop closer ties with his European home base again. In 1969, he accepted a permanent guest professorship for the summer semester at the then newly founded University of Constance. And then there, of course, he established the Constance Seminar on Monetary Theory and Policy, which has been mentioned several times before today, which in the 1970s and 80s had an enormous influence on monetary thinking in Germany, in Switzerland, and in continental Europe overall. In 1974, then Karl shifted the base for his European summer activities to the University of Bern, accepting a professorship, this has also been mentioned before, an econometrics professorship it was at the University of Bern. Instrumental in this on the side of the Bern faculty was his student friend Hermann Beery, together with Jürg Niehans, who returned to Switzerland from the USA and joined the faculty at Bern 2 years later. Karl laid the foundation there for a tradition of research and education in monetary theory and policy, which is still very much alive today. I'm looking at my colleague Harry Stellas and all the others, of course. And while at Bern, Karl founded yet another yearly conference series. It has been also mentioned a couple of times already, the Interlaken Conference on Analysis and Ideology, which regularly featured great scholars such as James Buchanan and Armin Alchi and Bill Meckling, Alan Meltzer, of course, and many others. Karl's interest in his European operations, apart from their sentimental value, was twofold. On the one hand, he wanted to promote structural reform at continental European universities, which he rightfully considered, especially in economics, as backward and still very much lagging in scholarship behind their much more dynamic American counterparts. He used his return to Europe actively and consciously as a platform for strengthening scholarly openness and exchange and introducing intellectual competition into a system which looked to him, and not only to him, as a closed shop devoid of intellectual stimulation and vitality. He wanted to break what he once described himself in an article in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung in 1975 as an implicit cartel agreement limiting mutual debate and critical analysis. Needless to say, encouraging his assistants and doctoral students to aggressively ask difficult questions and critical questions in seminars, regardless of who the speaker was, did not make him very popular among some of his visiting professorial colleagues of other Swiss and German universities. Karl's second motive was to spread his personal view of economics, in particular the insights of monetarism. And on both accounts, he proved to be highly successful. And this success, I think, can probably not be understood without considering his personality. As all who were acquainted with Karl know, Karl was a very warm, very extroverted person. But he was also kind of a missionary. The support and promotion of young academics to him was an affair of the heart. He very actively looked for and cultivated contacts with promising students and young colleagues, trying to spread his enthusiasm for economics and for science in general to them. I remember how in my first years at Ohio State, he very often found his way to my office or to that of another fellow, another young, to a fellow colleague, asking us about our projects, talking about new work by others, telling us his opinions of it and of the world in general. And I have always considered this as a great experience. And I think it is an example of the very best a university teacher can pass on to the next generation. I also know that I'm not alone in feeling this way, but that this is an experience shared by many, many others. Occasionally, I must add, this had its costs too. I remember when I've mentioned before that Karl, after he had left Ohio State for Rochester, that he often came back to Columbus. He continued editing the JMCP for a number of years. I was still his book review editor, and also he had some consulting with Columbus Bank, so he often came back there. And when he came to the university, he always came to my office and started to telephone. And Karl, as all who know him remember, was one of the most avid users of the telephone, a real friend of the telephone companies, and telephone charges at that time were high. And well, some at Ohio State jokingly had said several times that the main reason why Karl came to Columbus from UCLA probably was to be a bit closer to Alan Meltzer at Pittsburgh and thereby reducing his phone bills. But at the time I'm speaking of now, he did not only call Alan Meltzer, he had started his European operations. He called Manfred Neumann, who unfortunately is not with us anymore. He called Manfred Neumann and he talked to him for half an hour. He called other people in Europe and talked to them for a quarter of an hour, half an hour or longer. And then I had to justify this huge phone bill to my chairman. But fortunately, they knew Karl, and so they didn't fire me. Of course, Karl was not entirely unselfish in all this. He wanted to convince us of his views, of his convictions. But he did this with an academic honesty and an openness, which, in my opinion, is still exemplary today. Then Karl saw potential for improvement and promotion, and this was almost unavoidably the case, regardless of age and standing, if you had not already gone through his school before. Then he was extremely generous with invitations to his conferences and seminars, with arranging student and visitors exchanges and personal contacts, with advice in general. The young economists in the 1970s and 80s who were allowed to profit from this generosity, who were acquainted with new and innovative research ideas through Karl Brunner, and whose professional formation was shaped by him in one way or another, is legendary on both sides of the ocean. In exchange, he expected a certain intellectual loyalty, which could, I must admit, occasionally create a certain tension if you happened to disagree on a point which was important and dear to him. But considering all Karl gave us, that was all right. There is no doubt that Karl Brunner's activities in Germany and in Switzerland, along with those of a few similarly minded fellow economists, have had a deep impact on economics as an academic discipline in these countries and beyond, in influencing the way in which the discipline is taught, in influencing the way economic research is organized, and in shaping the thinking of a future generation of economists and economics teachers. Furthermore, his insistence on applying economic theory to issues of public policy has greatly influenced economic policy debates and actual policy making. This was most visible in the area of monetary economics, which, after all, was his foremost area of interest, which happened to be in a period of change and in sore need of intellectual guidance in the 1960s and 70s, a time which saw central banks initially helpless in the face of increasing and accelerating inflation. And this brings me back to monetarism. Spreading the gospel of monetarism, as I've said before, was on the top of Karl's agenda. Karl's interests were very broad, reaching far beyond money. It has been said before today here, econometrics, the philosophy of science, scientific methodology, the theory of public choice, economic policy in all its facets, they all received a lot of his attention. Yet it is fair to say that improving our understanding of money and its impact on the economy always remained the central part of his efforts. Now, what does the term monetarism really stand for? Of course, as it is true for all such labels, this is a matter of definition, and in this sense, not really important. It makes no sense to fight a war about definitions. That's me saying that. Karl, well, he might on occasion have been quite willing to fight a little war about definitions. I remember when I met Karl for the very first time at Johns Hopkins, that was, as I've said before, I witnessed what I thought at the time was rather a bit strange conversation between Karl and Jürg Niehans. It had to do with Karl's interest in scientific methodology and with his insistence on properly defining terms. Karl said something like, well, assume it's raining outside. You look out of the window and you tell me it's raining outside. And then he said, then I first have to ask you, can you prove that to me? You first have to define what you mean by raining, by the term raining. And well, I couldn't understand that. Of course, he was trying to make a point, but still I thought at the time, well, it makes for a pretty cumbersome conversation if you have to do that every time. At least you never run out of conversation. This can go on forever. But in any case, Karl Brunner had his own particular interpretation of what the essentials of monetarism were, which may have differed in certain ways from that of other monetarists. And given that he had coined the term, it was his right to choose his definition, if you wish. But this is not what I'm concerned with here. Monetarism was an intellectual movement developed as a reaction to the existing state of thinking on money and the economy in its time. At least this is the way I want to use the term here now. It was a response to what represented state of the art, mainstream economics at the time. And I want to concentrate on the central ideas and messages which were common to all the self-declared members of the movement, but which were in contrast to the prevailing view dominating monetary thinking when they came on the stage. I want to ask what these ideas mean for us today. Are they still relevant in a meaningful sense? What is their place in the history of monetary thought? This, I believe, measures the contribution of the monetarists to the development of monetary theory and policy. And this contribution, I've said it before, I think is much greater than many people today think. Among politicians, journalists, and even among fellow economists, I observe very different reactions to such a question. At one extreme, there are a few who view monetarism as a truth forgotten, who think of it as a lost treasure which must be retrieved and brought back to life, and then the world would be saved. This is not how I see it. I think this does not do justice to what the monetarists taught us. At the other extreme, there are those who see monetarism as an ideology out of the deep past, as a dogmatic kind of thinking which has failed and should be forgotten, disposed of quickly and completely. And this, of course, is equally mistaken. Those who think of monetarism in this way have no idea of what the term stands for in a historic view and no sense of the evolution of intellectual perceptions and the history of economic thought in general. The real contribution of monetarism, I think, is much more subtle and pervasive, and I want to review this contribution here, and I do that under 5 headings. First, money matters. First of all, you must remember that the original Keynesians of the 1940s and 50s, to a certain extent contrary to Keynes himself, did not hold monetary theory and policy in high esteem and considered the latter to be largely useless as an instrument of macroeconomic policy. Far into the 1960s, many textbooks expressed severe doubts about the ability of money to influence economic activity, be it because of an interest-insensitive demand for consumption and investment or because of a liquidity trap situation. To the early Keynesians, the macroeconomic policy tool of their choice was fiscal policy, government spending and taxation, not money. They were convinced of a strong dominance of fiscal over monetary policy as an instrument to influence economic activity. This early Keynesian view was broadly reflected in the texts you grew up with as an economics student in the 1960s. In Great Britain, the Radcliffe Report, the government report issued in 1959, revealed an extreme skepticism regarding monetary policy and completely played down the importance of money and its growth for the economy. Luckily, at the University of Zurich, where I started my economics education at the time, we had two teachers who did not adhere to this view and were strongly attached to the classical traditions of money and monetary policy. Friedrich Lutz was one of them. Unfortunately, few people know anymore today of him, but he was an extremely important and great scholar of worldwide renown at the time, and Jürg Niehans was the other. So I was saved the fate of growing up as a monetary analphabet, in contrast to many of my contemporaries at other universities at the time. The monetarists took up the fight against this prejudice towards money. Money matters became the battle cry of early monetarism. It matters for macroeconomic fluctuations, they meant. One of the central monetarist propositions, according to Karl Brunner, was the rejection of the Keynesian claim of a dominance of fiscal over monetary impulses. When I arrived in the US in the mid-1960s, these efforts were still viewed with some skepticism by parts of the Keynesian establishment. To be fair, it must be said, however, that a new brand of Keynesianism had also come up, led by economists such as Franco Modigliani, James Tobin, Samuelson, the neoclassical synthesis people, who had increasingly brought money back into Keynesian analysis. And also that the number of other economists less committed to a particular camp or school, like Edmund Phelps, pursued objectives similar to those of the monetarists. So in the course of the 1960s and by 1970, as a result of all these efforts, the Keynesians had refound their confidence in monetary policy. An active use of monetary policy along with fiscal policy to stabilize the economy, which ideally would eliminate all cyclical fluctuations, overcome the business cycle, hence became a trademark of Keynesian economics, and it has remained so since, of course. The monetarists then in turn would challenge these, in their view, overly ambitious and counterproductive attempts to stabilize the economy. But it is clear that they had played a decisive role in restoring money to its rightful place in macroeconomic analysis and bring back monetary policy as a tool worthy of consideration, revising the earlier contempt of the Keynesians of it. Second, activism and the role of policy rules. The leading Keynesians of the 1960s and 70s, economists such as Modigliani, Samuelson, Tobin, or Lawrence Klein, were and always remained deeply convinced of the possibility and the desirability of short-term macroeconomic stabilization policies. An appropriate use of monetary and fiscal instruments would allow a high degree of control of macroeconomic development, in their opinion, and this led them to recommend an active policy of short-run cyclical stabilization. The use of large-scale econometric models built on the principles of Keynesian theory, but including a detailed monetary sector, was seen as a major instrument in this pursuit. Economic policy to the Keynesians was a sequence of discrete individual policy actions, each of them historically unique. The monetarists, in contrast, were critical of such short-term policy activism and recommended a much more modest or passive use of monetary and fiscal instruments. They emphasized the importance of policy rules and championed their use. A policy measure taken once in a unique situation may have a certain effect on the economy, but similar policy measures taken repeatedly and routinely under given conditions may become anticipated and have different effects. Monetary policy, as Friedman famously said, affects the economy with long and variable lags, which are difficult to predict in advance, depending, for example, on the state of expectations, and this may also have to do with uncertainty about the appropriate model, a point which Karl, as it has been stressed again and again today, felt was extremely important. The monetarists collected empirical evidence showing that well-meant but misguided monetary policy historically had more often destabilized the economy rather than not. Policy rules, therefore, should take the place of discretionary policy decisions taken one at a time, they argued. And a fixed tool to expand a particular measure of the money supply, of course, became their favored monetary policy prescription. The monetarist emphasis on policy rules and their implications has without any doubt experienced a powerful influence on the development of economic theory and policy in the decades following the 1970s. Taken up and analytically refined in new classical macroeconomics, it also became more and more accepted by economists of a Keynesian orientation, and finally developed into a central piece of mainstream macroeconomics in general, notably in the context of the new Keynesian macro model, which became so popular in the 1980s and 90s. It should also be mentioned, however, that in practical policy application, monetarists have always accepted the necessity of a certain flexibility. For example, in their support for central banks like the Swiss National Bank or the German Bundesbank, when these central banks followed monetary policy concepts, but found themselves in need to use them in an elastic and flexible way. The monetarist emphasis on money growth and monetary targeting, in contrast to, say, interest rate or exchange rate targeting, has proved to be more controversial. I'll return to this. Third, inflation and inflation expectations. The early Keynesians of the 1940s and 50s were not equipped for analyzing inflation. Indeed, inflation did not appear in most of their models. Typically, a fixed price level was assumed and no distinction made between nominal and real, or if so, in a purely formal and analytically meaningless way. Inflation after World War II in the US was low and simply not seen as a problem well into the early 1960s. Monetary policy in the USA and in many other countries focused on money market conditions and aimed at keeping nominal interest rates low. But even in the 1960s and well into the 1970s, Keynesians remained analytically unprepared for the inflation consequences of the policies they had recommended. Samuelson and Solow, in a famous contribution in 1960, argued that empirical work by Alban Phillips, which became known as the Phillips Curve, implied a long-run stable trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and that this trade-off could and should be exploited by economic policy. The long-run Phillips Curve then became a workhorse of Keynesian economics. It helped turning monetary policy into a major instrument of employment policy. As is well known today, however, attempts to stabilize the unemployment at a given low level required more and more inflation, leading to an inflation acceleration, which was increasingly seen as a major public problem and proved to be very unsettling to Keynesian economics. The mainstream Keynesian macro model of the 1960s-70s, the neoclassical synthesis model, was unfit to analyze the process of inflation in a satisfactory way. Not surprisingly, inflation was frequently attributed to structural factors, to labor market problems, to psychological or sociological factors, while its fundamental monetary causes dropped out of sight. As a cure, incomes policies were suggested, or wage and price guidelines and similar devices. At the heart of this deficiency was the lack of a tool to analyze expectations and the failure to adequately distinguish between actual and expected inflation. And it was the monetarists, along with Phelps, who presented a solution to this problem, employing a straightforward learning mechanism for explaining expectations formations, adaptive expectations, and stressing inflation forecast errors as a major determinant of short-run cyclical variation. They provided a simple tool for the analysis of inflation, of the inflation process, which revolutionized inflation and monetary policy analysis. Restoring the vertical nature of the long-run Phillips curve and the monetary nature of long-run inflation, reviving, if you wish, old classical insights and bringing them back to their rightful place in mainstream economics. Only are we forgetting about these insights again today? This is another question. 4, money growth targeting. The particular rule for the conduct of monetary policy recommended by the monetarists was a rule enforcing steady growth of money. Karl Brunner and Alan Meltzer favored targeting central bank money, the monetary base, while Friedman and others preferred a broader money aggregate. The common argument of them all was, however, that targeting a monetary aggregate would produce better policy outcomes over the business cycle than trying to control money market conditions by steering an interest rate. And more fundamentally, they argued it was the only way to control the long-run inflation trend. By the 1980s, money growth targeting, as recommended by the monetarists, had become part of the policy procedures at many central banks. The Swiss National Bank, along with the German Bundesbank, was a pioneer in the use of money growth targeting and employed it successfully to bring down inflation to levels consistent with price stability after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in 1973. And Karl Brunner, of course, played an important role as an advisor in these developments. It has been mentioned before. I also assume that Kurt Schildknecht tonight in his dinner speech will add something on that. Both the SNB and the Bundesbank used monetary targeting much more flexibly and elastically than was proposed in pure monetarist theory, though. They never lost sight of the fact that price stability was their ultimate objective and that the monetary targets they set were just intermediate tools considered useful for realizing this final objective. And I must say they generally found the understanding and the support of their monetarist advisors for this practice. The biggest challenge to monetary targeting arose from the occurrence of instabilities in the demand for money, or velocity. In Switzerland, the demand for central bank money proved to be very unstable in the late 1980s and in the 1990s. Explaining and predicting its movements and its information content became increasingly difficult, rendering the relationship between the central bank's intermediate target and its ultimate policy objective more and more unreliable. As a result, central banks started to look for a more reliable nominal anchor for their policies, and they shifted to concepts based on direct inflation objectives, inflation forecasts, and implicit or explicit Taylor rule type reaction function governing central bank interest rates became defining elements of central banks' policy strategies. Inflation targeting, in contrast to money growth targeting, does not rely on a stable relationship between money inflation and inflation. It is true. Indeed, its analysis, as usually embedded in the new Keynesian macro model, does not leave any role to money and money demand, except as an analytically irrelevant appendix. Interestingly, however, today's controversy about the appropriate measure of the real equilibrium interest rate to be used as a benchmark for central banks' interest rate policy. Is it 3% or 2% or 0 or even negative, as some claim? This controversy, this uncertainty highlights that in practical application, inflation targeting and Taylor-type reaction functions face a challenge which is quite similar to that which was faced by monetary targeting before. In view of the uncertainties about the equilibrium real interest rate, inflation targeting might turn out to be as difficult a policy as monetary targeting has been in the past. 5, money, credit, and financial sector details. Current discussions about the need to take account of financial sector details in the analysis of monetary policy and its effects point to an area where mainstream macroeconomics has regressed in scope, in my view, behind the macroeconomics of several decades before. It was not least Brunner and Meltzer, it has been mentioned before. Alan has talked about this himself today. It was not least Brunner and Meltzer who have always stressed the credit view of monetary policy and of the process governing the propagation of monetary policy measures, a view which explicitly differentiates between different assets and the rates of return, including the return on real capital, and which centers on the adjustment of relative asset returns in explaining the power and the effectiveness of monetary policy. In this endeavor, of course, the monetarists met in spirit with James Tobin. Alan has also mentioned this this morning himself, with James Tobin, who followed a similar research program in his general equilibrium approach to monetary theory. And one of the best-known summaries of Tobin's approach, incidentally, was published by Karl Brunner in the first issue of his newly founded JMCB in 1969. What appeared as an intense rivalry and was staged sometimes as a fierce competition between alternative theories of money stock determination and monetary policy transmission represented really, in this case, efforts in kindred spirit, in my view. In contrast to these more distant approaches, mainstream monetary macroeconomics of recent decades has returned almost exclusively to models featuring just one earning asset and one rate of interest, the rate of interest representing simultaneously the rate of interest set by the central bank and the rate of return on assets in general. And I think this is a mistake. The 1970s and 80s marked the high tide of monetarist influence on the profession and economic policy. As time progressed, monetary theory moved on and faced new challenges not immediately related to the old controversies between the monetarists and the Keynesians. Rational expectations, new classical economics, real business cycle theory, new Keynesian macroeconomics with its emphasis on the role of various types of market imperfections and frictions, a new neoclassical synthesis, issues of credibility, of reputation, of timing consistency and commitment took a central place on the stage. On the issues which had been debated in the old controversy between the monetarists and the Keynesians, on the other hand, a considerable convergence occurred as time went on. New and more enlightened Keynesianism in the 1980s and 1980s began to accept many of the old monetarist propositions, particularly the idea of the non-existence of a long-run unemployment-inflation trade-off, the monetary nature of the long-run inflation process. Keynesians, while fundamentally still convinced of the possibility of cyclical stabilization, nevertheless became a bit more reluctant towards overly ambitious stabilization efforts. The importance of inflation expectations and the distinction between actual and expected inflation were not doubted by anybody anymore. The attraction of policy rules as a device for building up policy credibility and anchoring expectations found followers far beyond the monetarist camp. The monetarists have not won the argument on all accounts, however. Some elements of Keynesianism proved to be very resistant. Monetarists have receded from a rigid application of strict state-independent rules. To a certain extent, they began to accept that policy rules must find a balance between a firm commitment and the need for short-run flexibility in view of external shocks. In monetary policy practice, they have always supported such a moderate application of such flexibility in any case, as I've said before. While monetary targeting, as recommended by the monetarists, was used successfully as an instrument of disinflation policy in the high inflation world of the 1970s and 80s, especially in Germany and in Switzerland, it gave way to policies aiming at interest rates and direct inflation targets in the course of the 1990s and 2000s as a consequence of instabilities in the demand for money. At the operational level, monetary policy today is almost universally implemented through interest rate control, not base money control, as recommended by Karl Brunner, Alan Meltzer, and other monetarists. A somewhat ironic twist in this is given by the fact, however, that the programs of quantitative easing initiated and pursued by the Federal Reserve and other central banks in recent years has reintroduced a strong quantitative element of monetary control, which has really no place in the new Keynesian models, which have dominated thinking at central banks so much in recent times. Now, I'll come back to my initial question, the legacy of monetarism. The evolution of economic theory and of science in general does not take place as a rule, as a Hegelian process where one view, which has dominated the past, is completely toppled and replaced by something radically new and different. Rather, it takes place as a continuous process where those parts of existing theories and models which have proven useful are maintained, while those which have not stood the test of time are pushed out of favor, and new, more promising ideas take their place in mainstream thinking. Of course, this is a matter of trial and error, and sometimes we believe to have learned something which turns out to be unimportant anyway in the longer run. And sometimes we forget about something which we had learned before, like right now, I believe some. But all in all, I think this is precisely what has happened with the monetarists and the Keynesians. Monetarism has often been proclaimed outdated or even dead. In the past, the same has frequently been said of Keynesianism. And yet it seems that it tenaciously lives on. Today we have a new Keynesianism. This shows how ambiguous and opaque labels of this sort can be. Of course, Keynesianism as proposed in the 1940s and 50s, as well as the Keynesianism of the 1960s and 70s, are represented by no serious economists anymore today. The same is true for monetarism brand 1960-70. In this sense, they are both gone and dead. But both have influenced the evolution of macroeconomic theory and its application to monetary policy in decisive ways, and both live on in the concepts, in the theories and models developed and employed by later generations until today. And in this sense, they are both very much alive. The new Keynesian model of the recent past is something very different from traditional Keynesianism of the 1960s, not to speak of its 1940s, 50s antediluvian incarnation, even if not all politicians and journalists seem to be aware of the fact. It owes as much to the ideas developed by the old monetarists as it does to those of the old Keynesians. And in this sense, its designation as Keynesian is maybe a bit unfortunate and misleading. Very likely it would not exist without all these predecessors. And in this sense, older traditions live on and leave their mark on the ideas of the present and of future generations too. If we want to appreciate the value of what Karl Brunner and his monetarist friends and associates have done for us living today, we do not need to bring back the monetarism of the 1960s and 70s. We should not try to return to the past, set back the clock, resurrect the old days. And we certainly should not try to fight the old wars again. But we should take account of how their insights and achievements have interacted with those of other scholars in their own time and in later periods to create new views and concepts influencing our understanding of the economy and of the possibilities of monetary policy up to the present. And if we do that, we see that we have an amazing lot to be thankful for. Whoever is convinced that money and monetary policy matter, that policy rules matter, that the analysis of inflation and inflation expectations matter, that bank credit and financial market details matter owes a great intellectual debt to Karl Brunner and his monetarist colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernst, for, again, a brilliant presentation and talk. We have only a few minutes left, so Alan, please, for the first question. Microphone, please.
Let me start. I very much enjoyed what Ernst said. What I wanted to add were a couple of things. The most important of this is that on the question of what happened to monetarism, did it fail, Karl wrote his own paper about that in the Cato Journal and gave a talk. It's not about targeting, it's mostly not about targeting interest rates versus targeting money. It's about all the other things that you emphasize, having a long-run view, basing it on the best-known economics that we have, embedding it in a rule that you try to follow. And there, to the extent that there is a failure, the failure to me is that in current policy, I'll use the US as an example, but I could use the ECB just as well. The current policy is one in which, after having prevented the crisis, they piled excess reserves, $2.5 trillion worth of excess reserves on the bank's balance sheets. No one, including the Federal Reserve, has the slightest idea of how they're going to get rid of that, what they're going to do, where it's going to go. Monetarists very much reject the idea that you don't work on a policy where you don't know what the long-run consequences of the policy, to the best of your ability, will be. They have no idea as to how that's going to be resolved, and it could be resolved, they think, by just raising interest rates enough. But what will happen how high do they have to go? What will be the consequences of the height to which they have to go to get the banks to hold the excess reserves? No one knows the answer to that. You shouldn't do things where you have no idea as to what the longer-run consequences are going to be. The second thing that I dislike about there are three. The second thing that I dislike about the current policy is that in 1945, the major central banks took a pledge which said they would not use competitive devaluation as a tool. Quantitative easing is competitive devaluation. There's no other way to describe it. Use a name which has no meaning otherwise to do a thing which you don't want to admit. And now other central banks are doing that. And we're back to doing competitive devaluation. And that's painful to banks all over the world. Shouldn't be. The third thing is that the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, the original Federal Reserve Act, was written with the word independence, had two primary ideas behind it. One was the gold standard, because the US was on the gold standard officially, legally, from 1900 on. And the other was a rule which said the Federal Reserve may not buy any securities from the US Treasury, none whatsoever. Now, the gold standard, as we know, disappeared, and the rule which prevented them from buying government securities got subverted when they discovered how they could use open market operations and not buy them from the Treasury, but buy them the moment after the Treasury sold them in the marketplace. And so they've used that on occasion during World War II. Most people would not object to the idea that financing the war was more important than thinking about the inflation. But now, they finance the government's debt at practically zero interest rates for billions, trillions of dollars. That's not an independent central bank. That's an independent. I was interviewed by a British journalist who asked me, do you think that the Federal Reserve has lost its independence? No, I said, they gave it away. The last thing I want to say is, when Karl and I started the Shadow Open Market Committee, what was the reason for doing that? The reason was that if you listen to what was being discussed about anti-inflation policy in the United States, it was a choice between two things. There was one very vociferous group which said you need price and wage controls. The other vociferous group said you need to go back on the gold standard. Now, that had nothing to do with a major part of what economists who worked on these problems thought was the way to work on these problems. And the purpose of the Shadow Open Market Committee was to get across a public view that there were ways to deal with inflation. They were not costless, but they were effective if pursued adequately. And it was a happy moment for us when Paul Volcker announced, I am a practical monetarist.
I think I collect 2 or 3 more questions, and then
Okay.
Ernst, that you can give the answer. Alexander, please. Microphone.
Thank you very much. When I listened to you, Ernst, it brought back some memories. But I remember when I came back from the United States, fresh out of my PhD in the mid-60s, say, there were basically 3 important monetary economists that we knew in Switzerland. And you mentioned all 3. Karl, we knew, but he was in the United States. And at the time, he didn't have that much influence on academic life in Switzerland. He did a little bit later. The other 2 were Friedrich Lutz and Jürg Nihans. And I think I had the concern coming to Geneva that exactly Karl had also later on, but I was too young for that, but that academic education in Switzerland in economics was miserable. It was really bad, and one had to build something up. And I think the problem was until Karl came, at least in the German part of Switzerland, was that Lutz was not an institution builder, and Nihans sort of gave up. He got fed up. The other thing that strikes me is that when I came back was that the economics education was coming from the people who were trying to do something was from the United States, but the model of monetary discussions was a closed economy model. And one of the things that was lacking was discussing open economy, macroeconomics, or open economy monetary policy. Whether under fixed or flexible exchange rates, the open economy features were important. I'm not sure how much Karl and Alan did contribute to that, but certainly the Constance seminar was an opportunity for many of us to discuss those problems. Finally, on a practical side, I think many of the people who started, we have to give some credit to the Swiss National Bank, because I remember all the discussions we had, which were among the only enlightened ones with the Kurt-Schildknecht, George Rich and company. And that was maybe under the stewardship of Fritz Leutwiler, but that was a center of where monetary policy discussions were going on, unlike the Bundesbank, where there was really very little theoretical discussion at the time.
Peter Bernholz, please. Then microphone behind you.
Thank you. You did refer to the fact that first, the parameters used for monetary theory with using monetary aggregates proved to be, in the end, to be unstable. And now you also mentioned that the same has now happened in a certain way with the inflation targeting and interest rate measures using that. in my view, this is dependent on the fact that if events change very much in the surroundings, our usual theories of expectation formation don't work very well. Actually, we don't have good theories of expectation formation. We have some theories which work under very special conditions, but usually these special conditions are not there. And therefore, I would ask you, would you agree that as long as we have this state of affairs, and I personally think that we will have it always, otherwise we would not have any longer human freedom, by the way, then we will always see some change in the directions and the parameters we use to steer monetary policy.
Thank you. Ernst?
Okay. Well, Alan, I'm in sympathy with all, or most at least, of what you said. On the first point you mentioned, as I said, I reject the view that monetarism was just about monetary targeting, and it was about many other things. And the reason why I wanted to stress this here is that this is not seen that way by many people. If the term monetarism is used in this country at least today, and I think it's the same in other countries, in Germany, for example, or in Austria, then it's sort of restrained just to monetary targeting. And I think this does not justice to what you, Karl, and you and others did at that time. It does not justice at all. And then what you said about the current monetary policy, again, yeah, I agree with you too. That's why I said, just as an interjection in my talk, I'm not sure that we are in the course of forgetting certain things again that we thought we had learned at one time. Alexander, well, thanks for your additions. I think I agree with all of them. I just would say, you did refer to the 1960s in Switzerland. I don't think Jörg Niehans gave up. But at that time, he took a step in his career. He went from Switzerland, from Europe to the USA, and he wanted to build a new stage in his career. And of course, that did not enable him to change much in this country. Later on, after he had come back at Bern, I would argue that, I have a lot of respect, of course, for what Karl Brunner did, and I said that before, but in terms of changing the department at Bern, Jörg Niehans probably was more important, and he was extremely stubborn, and nobody could fight in the department, in the faculty meetings there, the way he did. And it was extremely difficult to go against him. And even Karl found it difficult sometimes. But that's just a sort of a footnote. And on your question, I would just say, of course, this kind of uncertainty that you were talking about is present in our world, and this is what Alan today has talked about a lot, and what Karl Brunner in his time emphasized a lot. And my response to it would be, the same. My response would be, as long as we have this kind of uncertainty, we have to be humble in what we are doing. We have to be modest and not try to achieve too much. Or the likelihood is great that it will go wrong in the end.
Well, thank you very much. Ernst, we are now coming to... We are now coming to the end of the first part of our event. And I would like to thank again all four speakers, Alan, Ben, Charles, and Ernst again. And I think we can award you with a big applause again.